This is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They were called enemy aliens by the very government they were willing to die for. While their mothers, fathers, and younger siblings sat behind barbed wire fences in internment camps across the American desert, these young men picked up rifles, pinned American flags to their uniforms, and marched into some of the deadliest battles of the Second World War. They did not do it because America had been good to them. They did it to prove a point that history would take decades to finally acknowledge. This is the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated military unit in the entire history of the United States Army, and the shameful silence that followed their extraordinary sacrifice. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within hours, the United States was at war. But for the roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent living along the American West Coast, the attack triggered something far closer to home: fear, suspicion, and decades of simmering racial prejudice erupted almost overnight. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years suddenly looked at Japanese-American families with cold, calculating eyes. Politicians went on the radio and called them dangers to national security. Newspapers printed headlines that made no distinction between the Empire of Japan and the American-born children of Japanese immigrants who had never even visited the country their parents came from. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, and with a stroke of a pen, he authorized the forced removal of over 100,000 Japanese Americans from their homes. They were given days, sometimes hours, to gather what they could carry. Businesses built over generations were abandoned. Farms tended for decades were left behind. Families were loaded onto trains and trucks and transported to remote, windswept camps with names like Manzanar, Topaz, and Heart Mountain. These were not luxury facilities. They were tar paper barracks surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire, sitting in the middle of deserts and swamps, baking in summer and freezing in winter. And the cruelest irony of all was that the majority of the people locked inside those fences were American citizens. Among those citizens were thousands of young Nisei men, the American-born sons of Japanese immigrants who had grown up playing baseball, attending public schools, and pledging allegiance to the flag every morning. Many of them had brothers in the Boy Scouts, sisters in the school choir, and fathers who had spent their entire adult lives building something on American soil. They were as American as apple pie and Sunday church services. But in the eyes of their government, they were classified as 4C, which meant enemy alien. It was a designation that cut to the bone. It told them, in the clearest legal language possible, that they were not trusted, not wanted, and not considered real Americans in any meaningful sense. And yet, when the government eventually came calling for volunteers to form a segregated Japanese-American combat unit, something remarkable happened. The War Department set a goal of 1,500 recruits from Hawaii and was hoping for 3,000 from the mainland. Instead, over 10,000 men from Hawaii alone stepped forward. Men who were already behind wire, men whose families had been stripped of everything they owned, men who had every justifiable reason to turn their backs on a country that had turned its back on them, chose instead to go to war for it. Their motto was 3 words that said everything about who they were: go for broke. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was officially activated on February 1, 1943, and began training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. The unit brought together Nisei volunteers from Hawaii and from the mainland internment camps, and almost immediately there were tensions between the two groups. The island men, known as Buddha heads, and the mainland men, referred to as Kotonks, came from vastly different experiences. The Hawaiian Nisei had not faced the mass incarceration, that had gutted mainland Japanese American communities. And the mainland men carried a trauma and a grief that the islanders had not lived through. But those differences dissolved quickly on the training grounds and in the foxholes of Europe. What bound them was larger than geography. They were all fighting the same battle, both overseas and at home. The 442nd arrived in Italy in the summer of 1944, joining the Fifth Army as it pushed northward through the rugged Italian landscape. They were attached to the 34th Infantry Division and almost immediately were tested in ferocious combat. At the Battle of Belvedere, they faced a veteran German SS battalion that was trying to break through to Naples. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting, with German mortars and machine gun positions turning every hilltop into a gauntlet. It was in those opening engagements that the 442nd first proved what it was made of, pushing through terrain and enemy resistance that had stalled other units. Commanders who had quietly doubted these soldiers began to revise their assessments very quickly. The 100th Infantry Battalion, made up largely of Japanese-American draftees from Hawaii, had actually been in Italy since 1943, fighting with such ferocity that it earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion due to its extraordinary casualty rate. It had already built a fearsome reputation before being absorbed into the 442nd structure, and the two units together formed a fighting force that would eventually rewrite the record books. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, reportedly said that these were some of the finest fighters in the entire United States Army, and that if he could have more of them, he would take them without hesitation. That praise meant everything to men who had been classified as enemy aliens just 2 years earlier. The action that would define the 442nd forever came in October 1944 in the dense forests of the Vosges Mountains in northeastern France. The 141st Infantry Regiment, a unit made up predominantly of men from Texas, had pushed too far forward and found itself completely surrounded by German forces. Cut off in the freezing, fog-covered forest with dwindling ammunition and rising casualties, they became known as the Lost Battalion. General John Dahlquist, commanding the 36th Division, looked around at the forces available to him and decided to send the 442nd in to break through and bring those men home. What made the decision almost unconscionable was the fact that the 442nd had just finished taking the town of Bifontaine at enormous cost to itself and was already badly depleted. The Nisei soldiers were sent into the Vosges anyway. What followed was 5 days of the most savage close-quarters combat imaginable. The Germans held fortified positions on the high ground, raining down artillery, tank fire, and machine gun rounds through the thick canopy of trees. The forest itself became a weapon, as artillery shells struck the treetops and sent explosions downward into the soldiers below in what the men called tree bursts. The 442nd clawed forward yard by yard, sometimes resorting to direct charges against German positions in the kind of desperate bravery that costs a great number of lives. When they finally broke through and reached the Lost Battalion, they had suffered approximately 800 casualties to rescue around 200 Texan soldiers. The math was staggering. The sacrifice was almost incomprehensible. When General Dahlquist called a full regimental parade to honor the men with their battle citations after France, he reportedly looked out at the formation and was taken aback by how thin the ranks appeared. He demanded to know where the rest of the men were. A commanding officer stepped forward and told him simply that the men standing before him were all that remained. Over 160 soldiers had been killed, and more than 1,200 had been wounded or were missing in action during those weeks in France alone. The general who had ordered those men into nearly impossible situations was looking at the survivors of his own decisions. The regiment's motto had not just been a slogan. Those men had literally gone for broke. By the end of the war, the numbers associated with the 442nd were simply astonishing. In total, approximately 18,000 men served in the unit over its lifespan, with the original 4,000-man force being replaced nearly 3.5 times over due to casualties. They earned over 18,000 individual decorations, including more than 9,000 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, over 560 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, and an unprecedented 8 Presidential Unit citations. No other unit in the history of the American military, before or since, has accumulated a combat record like that for its size and duration of service. They had fought in Italy, France, and Germany. They had broken the Gothic Line, rescued the lost battalion, and helped end the war in Europe. They had done all of it while their families remained behind wire fences in the American desert. On July 15, 1946, the 442nd marched down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., as President Harry Truman stood waiting for them at the Ellipse near the White House. It was raining. Truman looked at these men and told them something that had never been said to them by any American president. He told them that they had fought not only the enemy, but prejudice, and that they had won. It was a powerful moment, a recognition long overdue, and for many of the men standing in that formation, it was the first time they had heard the government acknowledge, even obliquely, the double burden they had carried throughout the entire war. But acknowledgement and justice are not the same thing, and the country that sent them home that day was far from finished with its hypocrisy. The soldiers of the 442nd returned to a nation that had not changed as much as Truman's words implied. Across the West Coast and beyond, returning Nisei veterans found signs posted in restaurant windows and shop doors that read, "No Japs allowed." Their families came back from the internment camps to find their homes vandalized, their farms taken over, their businesses gone. Some veterans were denied service at the same establishments that would have gladly served a German prisoner of war. Veterans organizations like the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars refused to allow Nisei veterans to join their existing posts, and some went so far as to remove Japanese American soldiers from their honor rolls entirely. The men who had fought and bled for this country were being told, in practical, everyday terms, that they still did not belong to it. The story gets even more troubling when you examine the question of the Medal of Honor. During the war, a number of 442nd soldiers had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Instead, many of those recommendations were downgraded to Distinguished Service Crosses, a lower honor that, while still enormously prestigious, was not the same recognition. For decades, the reasons for those downgrades were left unexplained. Veterans and historians suspected racial bias had played a role in the decisions, but the government did not revisit the question for over 50 years. It was not until the late 1990s, under a congressional mandate, that the Army finally conducted a review of the records. What that review found confirmed what many had long suspected. In the year 2000, President Bill Clinton stood in a ceremony and awarded the Medal of Honor to 22 veterans of the 442nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion, the majority of them posthumously. 21 of those medals were upgrades from Distinguished Service Crosses that should have been awarded decades earlier. For most of the men being honored that day, the recognition came far too late. Many had spent their entire adult lives after the war carrying the knowledge that their service had been officially minimized, and they never lived to see the full accounting. In 2011, President Barack Obama awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Nisei soldiers of the 100th Battalion, the 442nd, and the Military Intelligence Service. Another step in the long, slow process of the country catching up to what these men had actually done. The story of the 442nd is ultimately not just a military story. It is a story about what it means to love a country that does not love you back. They fought for the America that was supposed to exist, and that distinction, carried in the heart of the men who faced the worst the world had to offer them, while their own government treated them as suspects. Thanks for watching. Please support by subscribing and click on the notification bell button. See you there next on the next one.